Welcome, everybody. I hope you can hear me. This is the book talk with John Garth, co-sponsored by the Marion E. Wade Center and the Wheaton College Tolkien Society. My name is Laura Schmidt, and I am the archivist of the Wade Center and the staff advisor for the Tolkien Society. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. One logistical note as we get started. We ask that all participants keep cameras and microphones turned off and muted during the entire event, as that will enable everyone to see and hear the presentation clearly. Thank you so much for your help with that. John Garth is a freelance writer, researcher, and speaker, and has over 25 years of experience in journalism. He studied English language and literature at St. Anne's College in Oxford, and trained as a journalist, working for 5 years in local London newspapers and for 13 years on the London Evening Standard. He states on his website that he, quote, is particularly interested in how personal lives intersect with the big shocks and surges in history, end quote. He made some big waves in the world of Tolkien scholarship in 2003 with the publication of the acclaimed book Tolkien and the Great War. I have my copy right here. And that went on to win the Mythopoeic Award for Scholarship in 2004. He also published a study in 2014 of Tolkien's undergraduate life titled Tolkien at Exeter College. Today we're here to learn about his newest book, The Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien, The Places That Inspired Middle-earth. In this newest title, John sets the record straight over many of the claims popularly made about what places influenced Tolkien in the real world, as well as advancing many new claims. Personally, I cannot wait to read this book, and it is true with any book by John Garth that you will find clear, accessible writing, in-depth expert research and scholarship, and engaging, thought-provoking insights. I've long wanted to have John come to the Wade Center for an event, so we are grateful that technology has allowed for this opportunity despite the other challenges in our world at the moment. And this is the first official virtual Wade Center meeting online, so bear with us as we try this out for the first time. We also have a special announcement. The publisher of the book, Princeton University Press, has kindly offered a discount code. You can use the code Tolkien20, that's Tolkien 20, to receive a 20% discount on your order and free shipping through June 30th. You can support local bookstores by ordering the book online or by phone, and many bookstores are taking orders and delivering books despite closed storefronts at the moment. Bookshop.org is one online option I know of that supports local bookstores and is recommended by a lot of authors. The book can also be purchased directly from Princeton University Press. And one final note to participants before we begin, we are fielding questions for John in a question and answer time that will take place in the second half of this event. So please note your questions or comments in the Zoom chat box, and those will go directly to our event moderator, Erin Hill. I'll read questions out for John to respond to when we get to the question and answer time in the second half of the event. And a reminder, particularly to those who are just joining us, please keep your cameras off and your microphones muted during the entire event. We are recording this, and it will be available on the Wade Center's YouTube channel. So I want to invite John, if you haven't already unmuted yourself. There you are. I see you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so grateful to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's a great honor, especially to be part of this bold experiment.
Yes. We're very pleased that you're our first guest too. So I want to start off just by talking a little bit more about your background and really how you got into researching Tolkien specifically.
Tolkien was really kind of inescapable for me from the age of 9 when I read The Lord of the Rings. I've been reflecting on that moment, and I've told the story quite often how I came to start reading it. But the thing that's relevant here is that it was actually maps and place names that first really appealed to me before I even read the book. So my mother had this very large copy of the 1960s edition with the cover by Pauline Baynes, big yellow spine with Tolkien in big red letters on the back. And I would open it, and it was by far the biggest fiction book I'd ever seen. And I would gaze at the map and think, I want to go there. You know, I want to travel into this book. I want to travel into this world. And I did, you know, at a ridiculously young age. So that hung around, and I later went to Oxford and studied English language and literature there, though not with Tolkien's success, I have to say. I did moderately well, but and I didn't follow the medieval line. So my understanding of literature extends much more into modernity than Tolkien was actively engaged with, and concomitantly, I'm very ignorant of areas, medieval areas and linguistic areas in which he was absolutely expert. As the years rolled on, I was always bugged by the idea that Tolkien was just an escapist. And I couldn't quite put my finger on why I thought he was such a great writer, except that he moved me deeply and made me think about many things very deeply. Particularly war. That was something that was very much in my mind. It was reading the works of Tom Shippey, The Road to Middle-earth, that really woke me up to why Tolkien works. Later on, I was doing some work on Elvish, which involved me looking very closely at the Book of Lost Tales, which is the earliest version of the Silmarillion, edited and published by Christopher Tolkien in 1983 and 84, I think. And I was looking very closely at the chronology of composition. And I noticed that there were references to Tolkien writing poems about elves while in military training camp in France and in Britain. And that set the light bulb off for me, because I was also reading much more, I was reading fiction about the First World War, which is typical of the kind of literature that the First World War has inspired. Sebastian Faulks's Birdsong and Pat Barker's Regeneration, they're great books, but they take an unrelentingly realistic and grim view of the specific time. They look very closely at it. Tolkien, meanwhile, as I saw, when he was actually in the First World War as a soldier, was writing about elves, about fairies, as he called them. So that seemed to me very intriguing, and I wanted to know why. And so I wrote this book. It started out as a fanzine article and kind of got very much out of hand.
Was your reading of Tolkien and your interest in the war part of your studies at all at college, or was this all in your own time that you were delving into that? And how does it match up with your journalism background? It's all very.
So it was absolutely in my own time. Oxford at that stage, which was the mid-1980s, did not seem especially proud of Tolkien. I think he was someone that the academics there would have been shy of praising, and a lot of them would have dispraised him as often as possible. There's a bust of him by his daughter-in-law Faith in the English faculty library, but it stood as far away as possible from any passers-by. I always thought he looked terribly isolated.
They have another one tucked away, I think, in Exeter College Chapel. There's a little
right, yeah. Journalism. Well, Oxford taught me how to write reasonably decent essays about literature. It didn't really teach me how to write to communicate to human beings. And journalism did. So I had to unlearn a great many things I learned as an undergraduate in terms of communication, writing to grab the attention, keep the attention, and also, just as important, writing with accuracy and checking your sources, not saying things that are disproportionately wild. So when it came to writing Tolkien and the Great War, which was again a huge learning experience in which I spent about 6 months just trying to find my voice, which sounds terribly vain, but you know, you write and you write and you write and you think this just doesn't feel right, this doesn't sound right.
And every author has to take that journey. That's not vain at all. That's just
right. Eventually you reach a point and you realize that you're writing, you're comfortable with your writing.
Yes.
And I feel that it combines what I learned as an undergraduate and what I learned as a journalist in terms of writing, plus my research, which was partly from journalism, but more from what I'd done in my spare time in my 20s, oddly enough, was family history. So I was always the youngest person at these archives, which were haunted by pensioners, retirees.
I appreciate you being there as a young person. I love to see young people come to the Wade Center to use our materials too.
And that taught me again that, you know, I had a real nose for ferreting out the facts. I had a great deal of patience for looking through material that might yield rewards once in 2 days, you know. But I knew that I had this hunger to establish facts as far as I possibly could, but also to get into the skin. This is always the frustration of family history for me, because my family were quite impoverished in the 19th century, left no written records, so one could not enter into their worlds, their minds, except by reading general history. Writing about Tolkien, I had many more resources to get inside his head. Not as many as I would have liked, because, you know, he didn't keep a diary of his experiences in the First World War, and his letters to Edith were unpublished, they remain unpublished. But it was possible to draw an awful lot of information together so that one could step inside his shoes.
And that's something I really appreciate about your writing, and I can see how your journalism background supports it, in that you're communicating and you want to be an effective communicator, but also based very much in fact and in research. And I love it when something's so accessible, but is so insightful at the same time. And my favorite scholars always do both, but it's a tough thing to do, to have great thoughts and insights and research, but also communicate them clearly. And I saw that in Tolkien and the Great War, and I'm sure, I haven't seen your new book yet, but I'm sure it has all of that going for it as well. Tell us a little bit about this newest book, The Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien, and how it differs from other books on the topic. There have been people out there writing about this for a while, and there's a lot of hearsay about what influenced him. So tell us about what your book is about now.
Well, the books previously published on the subject, they're interesting. They're helpful in some ways. So there are 3 books by Robert S. Blackham, beginning with The Roots of Middle-earth, which is about the West Midlands of England and the Oxford area, Tolkien's Oxford, and I think Tolkien and the Perils of War. They're kind of pocket-sized books with lots of photographs, lots of archive photographs, black and white. And they, I would say, err on the side of credulity. So Bob Blackham is very keen to make connections between the area he himself grew up in as well, and Tolkien's Middle-earth, and I think he's a bit too willing to believe that such and such thing might have influenced Tolkien. One of his books, in fact, the first one, I think, on the back of it, there's a photograph of one of the so-called 2 towers of Birmingham, which were a water tower and a folly, a tower with no real purpose, that stood in a road around the corner from one of Tolkien's childhood homes. And this kind of thinking has led to the idea that it's almost official, it seems, that these 2 towers inspired Tolkien's 2 towers.
Right.
Now, there are many problems with this idea. and I write about this in the book. The key one is that Tolkien came up with the title, The Two Towers, after the fact. He invented all the towers in The Lord of the Rings, finished writing the book, and then was presented by his publisher with the problem: we need to split this huge work into 3 volumes, and we need a title for the middle volume. So The Two Towers was sort of thrown together as a title, and Tolkien didn't even know which of the towers, Orthanc, Minas Tirith, Minas Morgul, Barad-dûr, it referred to at first. There's another book, Matthew Lyon is the author, and it's called There and Back Again, in the Footsteps of J.R.R. Tolkien. And that's a very different book. It's a kind of extended thought piece where the author visits various places that he believes may have inspired Tolkien and ruminates on how they might have done so. Again, I feel that although it's a very interesting read and it has some insights in it, the author is too willing to believe that such a thing has influenced any number of things. So he writes about a visit to Lydney Park in Gloucestershire, where we know that there was an excavation in the 1920s by an archaeologist called R.E.M. Wheeler. And when Wheeler came to publishing the report on the excavation of this Roman temple, he got Tolkien to write a brief analysis of a name of a god, Nodens, that appears in inscriptions there. Matthew Lyon takes from this that Tolkien visited the place, that it inspired dwarves, orcs, hobbits, and various other things. And there's no evidence he did visit. We know that he corresponded with Wheeler, but beyond that, nothing. B, to draw so many things out of one point seems to me absurd. And apart from anything else, some of these things Tolkien had invented before his work on the name from Lydney. So I don't spend a great deal of time debunking things in this book, but that's one of them. So I have an appendix on Lydney, and that's not a photograph of Lydney, by the way, but it's very beautiful nonetheless, where I take these ideas to pieces. But on the whole, the purpose of the book for me is to look more deeply into the nature of inspiration. So in a similar way to what I did with Tolkien in The Great War, where I'm looking at Tolkien and history, here I'm looking at Tolkien and geography, but geography that's bound up with culture and with history, and with Tolkien's passionate love of the natural world, and of certain cultural things. So I talk about the influence of the arts and crafts movement in Birmingham specifically, for example, which I think it's easy to miss now that we are 100 years later, 100 years and more later, and don't live in Birmingham, and Birmingham has massively changed in all of that time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's a great leaping off point for another tangent question connected to it. It might seem obvious to some people how this book would be helpful for scholars, but I'd like you to comment on that specifically, how you think this is going to impact scholarship on Tolkien, or what aid will it give to scholars who are studying Tolkien to have this book as a resource now, but also general readers, people that are just reading The Lord of the Rings for personal pleasure, or people discovering it for the first time like you did when you were a child. What could this book give to them to really aid their experience reading Tolkien's works?
Well, I'm going to read a passage or a few passages shortly, which will illustrate that. One of them is just to show that, to show once again, in fact, that Tolkien's invented world is not some vast abstraction cooked up in a professor's study. It closely connects with his own experience, or some of his own experience. It closely connects with his own passions for history and philology, which has obviously been more than touched on by other people, but it comes into this book as well. Why will it help? So one of the frustrations of the kind of discussion that takes place about places that inspired Tolkien is that all you tend to get is a kind of A to B relationship. This place inspired this place, and that's it. And what can you do with that? Not very much, I think. When I started looking at it, and I have to say that the book was suggested to me by a friend who's not a Tolkien fan, and when I heard the idea, I thought, well, I don't know if I want to write that. It's, you know, everyone talks about this on the internet, and what they say is often really silly. But then I got into it, and I realised that there's this vast entanglement, interthreading of ideas, of influences. And it's rather like the wonderful way in which Tolkien interlaces detail within his writings about Middle-earth. So it's incredibly rich. Helping academics, well, I hope it does. I think that the study of the creative process is endlessly fascinating, and I think it ought to be a focus of academic study more than it is. When I was an undergraduate, one of the things that we did not do was look at the lives of the authors. We did not discuss authorial intention at all. We saw it as so elusive that the whole idea was almost a taboo. And of course, Tolkien said the same kind of thing himself.
He wasn't overly comfortable about it either, yes.
Right.
Right,
And
yeah.
C.S. Lewis did. C.S. Lewis co-wrote an essay on the subject called The Personal Heresy. Nonetheless, I think it's, regardless of what the author himself says, it's a valid subject of study. So I've been very thorough with it. I haven't had the opportunity to write at the length that I'd like to about some things, and there. So for example, I gave a talk, 45-minute talk last year to the Tolkien Society, their annual convention, their 2019 Birmingham convention,
right.
about the Two Towers of Birmingham, and the thread of that argument appears much more compressed in this book. But I've been very rigorous, I think, in sourcing everything. I went over the index very, very thoroughly, so it's going to be a useful tool for people to dive into. Yeah.
Well, I'm loving the fact that I'll have this as a reference book now in the Wade Center to help with any inquiries that come my way. And when I visited England just a couple of years ago, I found it pretty exhausting to have tour guides be telling me all kinds of things that I knew were not based in fact about which architectural details in Oxford influenced C.S. Lewis or Tolkien. So I'm really grateful to have something that's been thoroughly researched that's going to be available to people either for casual interest or for scholarship. I think this book has a lot of different benefits for a lot of different people that come to it. So thank you for your work and your effort in that. So appreciated. Would you like to share us a little reading from the book so we can get a taste of what delights await us when we read it ourselves? And we'd love to see the cover too. It's just a beautiful book. They did a very nice job producing it.
So yeah, so there's the cover. It's a quite chunky book as well, and much thicker than I realised it would be, and it's physically very beautiful. The UK and the US editions are printed by the same printer, so they're exactly the same, apart from the mark of the publisher Princeton in the US and Francis Lincoln in the UK. I thought I'd just kind of flick you through some of the chapters. So this is all about Tolkien's arrival in England and falling in love with it, and how it influenced, I mean, among other things, obviously the Shire. And And I talk about Tolkien's influences from further afield, from worldwide. So this isn't specifically about place, it's more about culture, but I think vital for understanding Tolkien's thinking. That's the chapter 4 Winds. Then I have a chapter where I talk about how Tolkien started out and continued to incorporate England or Britain into his mythic history. So in all of his Middle-earth stories, England or Britain is the outcome. Even if in Lord of the Rings, the outcome is millennia into the future. So there we have the land of Luthien. That's a photograph of the bridge in Great Hayward, where Tolkien lived with Edith in 1917, which comes into his mythology. Another really vital one that's, you wouldn't know it from reading The Hobbit and even perhaps from reading Lord of the Rings is the sea. So there's a very large chapter on that one, which turned out to be much more fascinating to me, many findings for me there. The roots of the mountains, and you can't tell that this is the most exquisite photograph, even from the PDFs when I was seeing the book in PDF form. I had no idea how beautiful the print was going to come out.
Is that out of Switzerland by any chance, or where was that?
That's Lauterbrunnen, the clear inspiration for Rivendell.
Rivendell, yeah.
There's a chapter on rivers, lakes, and waterlands.
I love this sneak peek. Thank you so much. I feel like everybody's going to want to read this, seeing all the chapter headings.
Forests.
Of course. Of course. Very important.
It was a major challenge, actually, to decide what orders to tell things in and how to split the subject up.
I'm surprised the book isn't thicker.
Yeah, well, it almost was. If the publisher hadn't been cracking the whip, it might well have gone on for a year or two. As it was, it took about 7 months to write. So this is about towers, essentially, towers of guard, and also the idea that a valuable civilization guards its knowledge, its lore, its wisdom. Places of war, which expands upon things that I say in Tolkien and the Great War, where I don't really talk about the influence of war on Lord of the Rings, for example, of Tolkien's own war experiences on Lord of the Rings in that book, but I do in this new one.
Okay.
Last chapter is craft and industry. So that's a photograph of canals in Birmingham from the very heart of it all when Tolkien was young. Yes, so you want me to read an excerpt. So what I've decided to do, one of the ways I managed to shoehorn lots of information in, lots of comment, was by having panels. So as well as the main text, which you see here at the top, there's text against this kind of pale brown background. And these are little snippets that will frustrate you if you're trying to read the book straight through, because you'll have to decide where on the page you're going to stop to dip down and read the...
Choose your own adventure reading.
Read the panel, that's right. And there's also loads of cross-references within the text, because inevitably anything I said, any place that I described in one chapter would need to be mentioned, discussed in another chapter as well.
Right.
So here, I want to read 3 bits, all relating to Warwick, which is the town in which Tolkien and Edith married in March 1916.
For us outside of the UK, can you tell us about where that is?
So it's in the West Midlands. If you were to drive now northwest from London for 2 hours, I think, you get to Warwick.
Okay.
But it's a historic old town with a castle. And the panel is called A Mythology for England. I was from early days grieved by the poverty of my own beloved country, said Tolkien. It had no stories of its own, not of the quality that I sought and found as an ingredient in legends of other lands. He grew up in an era when mythologies were seen as vital to the identity of nations. But the matter of Britain, the huge body of medieval stories of King Arthur and his knights, was Celtic at root and drenched in French influence. Even the great Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf was essentially Scandinavian. Compared with the traditions of Greece, Finland, Wales and elsewhere, native English legends seemed to him impoverished chapbook stuff. Popularised anew during his youth, they were both a frustration and a creative spur to him. The colossal Warwick pageant of 1906 testifies to the common passion for a historical and legendary past. With 80,000 people flocking to see a 5-day run, the Times enthused that nothing like it can have been staged since the days of Queen Elizabeth I. It was a pioneering example of the pageant fever or pageantitis that swept England over the following decades. Short dramatic tableaus were performed on Warwick Castle's lawn. One reenacted the defeat of pagan Viking invaders 1,000 years earlier by King Alfred's daughter, Athelflaed, Lady of the Mercians. Other scenes had little or no historical basis, whether they showed druids attempting to sacrifice innocent children, or ancient British lords of Warwick such as Gwar the Mighty, or medieval townsfolk hauling the hewn-off head of the monstrous dun cow. It's a dragon, its eyes still blinking and its nostrils aflame. And this is one of the lovely archive photos I found. I don't know if you can see that.
Oh, wow. That's great.
Most of this came from a 15th century history of Warwick by antiquary John Rouse, who had concocted some of the legends and taken others from Geoffrey of Monmouth's entirely unreliable 12th century history of the kings of Britain. Perhaps it was partly with this pageant in mind that Tolkien wrote a poem about Warwick as a fading town where old memory is waning. However that may be, he was frustrated by the incoherence and lack of mythic richness in such native legends. It was this, together with the shining examples of other nations' great mythologies, that spurred him to attempt to create a body of more or less connected legend, as he put it, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. And then I'm going to move us back to the main text. In Tolkien's earliest conceptions and in the Book of Lost Tales, the lonely Isle of the Elves and Britain are one and the same place. Tolkien's island derives its blessedness from its elven past and an elusively lingering elven presence. Besides binding his homeland into his mythology, Tolkien also interwove his personal life. The poem The Lonely Isle, written in France in 1916 after he crossed the English Channel for the trenches of the Somme, yearns most poignantly for one town in particular. I long for thee and thy fair citadel, where echoing through the lighted elms at eve, in a high inland tower there peals a bell. O lonely, sparkling isle, farewell. The citadel town is Warwick, where Tolkien had spent happy hours with Edith Bratt over the past 3 years, and where the two had married that March. Tolkien drew a set of 3 heraldic devices for places in the Lonely Isle that celebrate the milestones of his life with Edith. And one of the great things about the book is that the Tolkien estate allowed us to reproduce his own artwork.
That's wonderful.
He added names and phrases in Gnomish, the second elven language that he had invented, the eventual basis for the Grey Elven language Sindarin. The device for Corturion stands for Warwick, where Edith had moved after their 1913 reunion. The trees, where are we? I'll show you it again. This is the central image here.
Mm-hmm.
The trees are the ones that inspired Tolkien to call Warwickshire Al-Alminore, land of elms, and which feature so prominently in a 1915 poem, Corturion Among the Trees. In the foreground is the peacock, frequently seen on contemporary postcards of Warwick Castle. The tower perhaps recalls the one which, according to Warwick tradition, had once stood upon Ethelfleda's mound, the conical earthwork beside the castle. And Ethelfleda, of course, is the same figure I mentioned earlier, Ethelflad, King Alfred's daughter. And there's a postcard here with the peacocks.
I'm loving all these archival sources too. Thank you for your diligence and tracking down what I'm sure was a lot of work, all of those different images.
Absolutely was, yeah. That was a major stage of the process. Tolkien names the Tower of Ingil, the elven lord who first settled the Lonely Isle, according to his earliest version of the mythology. In the earliest lexicon, the island is Ingilnore, Ingil's land, an obvious pun on England. The lexicon gives Cortirion a resident goddess of love, music, beauty, and purity, Erinti, who has a tower guarded by elves but lives in a circle or corrin of elms. She seems to represent Edith, but is never seen again in the mythology. In the heraldic device and the Book of Lost Tales, the island has an elven queen instead, Meril Itirinkwi, who also lives in a corrin on top of a hill, probably inspired by Athelfleda's mound. And now I leap to the chapter titled Tree Woven Lands. Springing to life apparently without prior planning in 1941, Tolkien's most famous fairy treescape had actually been rehearsed in his earliest. Scholars have long pointed out Lothlorien's debt to medieval visions of paradise, notably to the silver-leaved heavenly land in Pearl, a Middle English poem that Tolkien revered and exquisitely translated. There are overall resonances with the Lost Realm in the Henry Rider Haggard romance She, though not obvious in terms of landscape. Meanwhile, the Flet, or treehouse of Galadriel and Celeborn, with its tree trunk through its midst, recalls the more earthbound hall of the Germanic Volsungs, built around a living tree, the Barnstock. Tolkien had described it in his own retelling of the story of Sigurd the Volsung, tall and branching, that house upholding, the hall's wonder, its leaves their hangings, its limbs rafters. However, Lothlorien's most formative influence was surely the 1915 poem Cortirion Among the Trees, a celebration of Warwickshire as the land of elms, Al Minore in the fairy realms. The English elm, dubbed by one writer the quintessence of the English landscape, was a dominant feature of the country's fertile marl terrain. Lothlorien is a land of malorn trees, a species of Tolkien's own invention. He compared the malorn to the beech, upright grey trunk and perpendicular branches upswept at the tips, but he gave it the same massive majesty that he praised in the elm. In a punning piece of early language invention, he had made elm the elvish exclamation for marvellous. However, the malorn stands for longevity, the very opposite of the elm. The malorn does not suffer winter as other trees do. In autumn, its leaves turn gold, but they do not fall until spring, when its branches fill with golden flowers. English tradition associates the elm with transience and death, its timber-made coffins and ships' keels. It had a reputation for dropping branches without warning, and it was notoriously prone to disease long before Dutch elm disease killed up to 30 million British trees in the 1970s. Mortality hangs heavily over Cortirion Among the Trees, that 1915 poem, as might be expected from a poem written when Tolkien's generation was being cut down on the battlefields of France and Belgium. In both Lothlorien and Cortirion, Tolkien visualizes the trees as ship masts. Lothlorien is a bright ship masted with enchanted trees. In summer, Cortirion's elms are like masts of verdurous ships under full sail, but in naked winter they are like vessels floating vague in the distance. Perhaps in 1915, the long narrow island in the Avon below Warwick Castle, planted with trees by 18th century landscape gardener Capability Brown, had brought the image of a masted ship to Tolkien's mind. Lothlorien and Cortirion have yet more striking arrangements of trees in common. In the Book of Lost Tales, Cortirion's elf queen Merrill lives on a hill amongst glorious elms in a circle of 3 lessening stories of bright foliage. The inspiration for that hill, Ethelfleda's Mound in Warwick, has no such ring, but across the Avon in Castle Park stood Lord Brooke's Clump, one of the many hilltop tree landmarks that enrich the British skyline. Clumps or clusters of trees like this look timeless, though typically planted by 18th century landowners for scenic reasons. Some actually stand on ancient sites, like the Seven Sisters beaches in the Quantock Hills, where Tolkien walked at least once with fellow Inklings C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield in 1937. The mysterious wizard-like figure in Tolkien's 1914 painting, Eeriness, walks below 3 prominent hilltop trees. In the Silmarillion, the 2 trees of Valinor stand on the green mound Azelohar. Other people, too, have linked such clumps with unseen power. Alfred Watkins, in his 1925 book, The Old Straight Track, argued that they marked Stone Age ley lines. To artist Paul Nash, the beaches of Twin Whittenham clumps. This is Nash's painting.
Lovely.
On a Bronze Age site near Wallingford in Oxford, seemed in his youth to be as significant as the pyramids. Oh, and there's also a photograph of Warwick Castle, and you can just see the mound next to it. As a circle, Merrill's hilltop clump in Cortirion resembles English tree formations like Chanctonbury Ring on the South Downs. In the Book of Lost Tales, the shape is given a Quenya name, Corin, a great circular hedge, be it of stone or of thorn or even of trees, that encloses a green sward, a definition that links it with sacred Celtic and Germanic groves and even Neolithic henges. Merrill and the Corin of Cortirion are forerunners of Galadriel and her tree city of Caras Galadhon. But the landmark at the very heart of Lothlorien is even more reminiscent of Merrill's Corin, Cerin Amroth, from the Sindarin word Cerin, round enclosure. A mound topped by a lawn within a double crown of tree circles. Here, in a moment of vision, Frodo sees Aragorn as if made young again, speaking words of love to his betrothed, Arwen. In his memory, as he wrote this, perhaps, Tolkien was with Edith in Warwick again in the springtime of their younger days.
That's lovely. Oh my goodness, if that isn't what your appetite to read this book, I don't know what else will. I want to transition into our question and answer time. Thank you for folks who have been sending your questions in the Zoom chat. The first one is from Jeremy Edmonds. Just want to give a shout out to Jeremy.
Oh, hi, Jeremy.
For joining us. He asks, what was your favorite discovery as you researched this book? If you can pick one, yes.
I think Jeremy actually knows this one. He had advance notice because he visited the place with me and with Jason Fisher back in 2018. So the place is Farringdon Folly, and it's 18 miles from Oxford. And a folly is a tower, as I mentioned earlier, or any kind of building that is built without a purpose, simply for the sake of itself. And I saw a painting of this. Let's see if I can find it quickly without getting too lost. I saw a painting of this in a book I was using for research.
Oh, wow.
Which struck me as being rather similar, reminiscent of Tolkien's painting of Hobbiton for structural reasons, right? The building in the foreground, the windy road, the middle ground, the cloudy distance, and of course the hill itself,
right,
in the centre.
It's beautiful.
So I started looking at the history of the place, and it turned out this tower, this folly, was built in the 1930s just as Tolkien was working on reworking his famous lecture Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. In fact, he had written lectures for Oxford undergraduates. Now, this lecture contains a famous allegory of the tower, where Tolkien tries to express his frustration with critics who have misused this great work of art, the poem Beowulf. Critics who have only ever used it as a quarry for historical information or philological information, archaeological information. Tolkien felt that that was all well and good, but it was time, surely, to recognise that Beowulf was a work of art in its own right. And as published, his lecture symbolises the poem itself as a tower, which the builder has built from old stones in a field. His neighbours don't understand why the tower has been built, and they think that he's misused these old stones, so they knock the tower over in order to examine the stones. And this is a tragedy to Tolkien. It symbolises the damage that the critics were doing to Beowulf. Now, in his undergraduate lecture version of this, it wasn't an allegory of the tower, it was an allegory of the rock garden. So the idea is that the builder doesn't build a tower, he takes the old stone, he uses it to make a rock garden, which was quite a fashionable middle-class thing at that time. And his neighbours pick apart the rock garden to look at the rocks, right? So you might say, well, that's not very Tolkienian, but actually I think it is, because it makes me think it's something that Bilbo might do. It's very hobbity, something Tolkien might do too.
Yeah.
But obviously the tower really taps into, the idea of the medieval and so on. But I think the key reason that Tolkien changed it is because at that very time, Farringdon Folly went through a very loud controversy, a planning controversy. The builder, Lord Berners, was not allowed to build it at first. There were major protests against it. And he was a famous eccentric. So it was not only in the local papers, but in the national papers. And I think Tolkien, and it was finally built. It was completed in 1935, just a couple of years before Tolkien gave the famous lecture. 1 year before. I think Tolkien giving the lecture about the allegory of the tower would inevitably have raised a laugh, because people would have known that a story about a tower that was deeply unpopular with its neighbours, so unpopular that they pushed it over, had a reflection in real life, though Farringdon Folly thankfully still stands. And I think, therefore, Tolkien must have used it deliberately. And been influenced by that local event. So I thought that was a very happy discovery. No one had noticed it before. And it comes down to, my tried and tested method of looking very closely at chronology and proximity, so you can trace things. And there are further lines, really fascinating lines that come from this that take us into Middle-earth, so we can make connections between the Elf Towers west of the Shire and Farringdon Folly, even between Orthanc and Farringdon Folly.
I love that observation about the importance of historical context, and looking a little further afield than just the primary texts at hand. So that's really engaging.
Right. So many people, so there's a very popular idea that Tolkien was inspired by Ireland, and another one that it was inspired by the Ribble Valley in Lancashire. And he did visit both of those places, but he visited them too late for them to have influenced The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Very important to note those things. Our next question comes from Gail Harlow. She says, you mentioned the naming of the two towers and the towers in Birmingham. Wasn't the two towers originally supposed to be named the Treason of Isengard? And I believe one of the History of Middle-earth books has that name.
There were various names tossed around. I think that was the Treason of Isengard was mooted as the title of book 3, rather than of books 3 and 4 together. But I forget, to be honest.
It's a detail question. Dennis Bevan asks, did Christopher Tolkien have a chance to see this book in some form or another? And for those who don't know, Christopher Tolkien passed away earlier this year. So I don't know if he did. Did he have a chance to see any of the text?
He did have a chance. I don't know whether he did see it, because the text was sent at its more or less final form and layout to the Tolkien estate for various approvals. So, I mean, I say this, as far as I know, this was all done by the publisher, and we certainly had to wait for permissions on various things. He helped with regard to a couple of points. So, you know, I asked him about Farringdon Folly, for example. I was desperate to know if they had visited it. All he could say was that he'd known about it as a child, and later lived near it himself. He helped, he sent his son Adam up to the attic to find his father's copy of a book called In Northern Mists by Fridtjof Nansen, the Norwegian explorer, which I think was a major influence on Tolkien's conceptions of the Great Sea and what lies beyond it. So yeah, he was well aware that it was being written.
Very cool. Our next question comes from Monica Sands from Spain. Thank you for tuning in from Spain today. Do you think that the landscape can be considered another character in Tolkien's books, which is a question a lot of people have? And a follow-up question, which landscape from the ones you include do you think the most breathtaking?
No, does she mean which real or which fictional landscape? So landscape as character, yes, absolutely. It is anyway. I think Tolkien's one of the great landscape writers. You know, his writing, I think, rivals. There's a fabulous passage by Thomas Hardy describing a place he calls Egdon Heath, which is a real place in the south of England, which he's renamed. I think Tolkien's own writing rivals that, and both have this kind of brooding atmosphere that give it a sense of personality, even though that's a very numinous and abstract sense. But Tolkien, of course, also imbues his landscapes with actual personalities. So, of course,
well, Caradhras, the mountain, you know, has a kind of sentient quality to it. That's a good one.
Perfect. Thank you very much, because I'd suddenly gone blank. Caradhras. Yeah, Caradhras the Cruel. Which is the most spectacular? Wow.
Or maybe one that you visited that really struck you the day you were there.
You know, one of the things about this book is it's not a travelogue. I have not assiduously visited every location. Of course, I would love to have done, but by the time the book was commissioned, I had no time to take out from writing to travel all over these places. And of course, it's an expensive business too.
Yes.
And in my defense, I think that often it can lead you up the garden path, because naturally, one of our primary reactions when we want to enter imaginatively into something is to bring our own experience to bear on it. And I think it's far too easy to see something and be overwhelmed by it and think, gosh, Tolkien must have been overwhelmed too, and he must have seen this, you know. So one of my favourite places that I think is awe-inspiring is the White Horse of Uffington, which we know Tolkien visited. We have it on record in Christopher Tolkien's words. And there's a painting here.
I think that has a Chestertonian connection as well.
Yes, that's right. The Ballad of the White Horse. So this is by Eric Revilius.
Yes.
Fabulous painting.
See it up there on the hill. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very cool. Kate Neville has our next question. Is there any place you left out because you couldn't confirm the influence, but you suspect might have become one of the bones of the soup?
Wow. Yeah, I think the answer is yes, almost certainly, but I can't remember now. You know, there's
probably a lot to choose from, I'd imagine.
there was a stage of a few weeks where I was simply, you know, marshalling my information, research that I'd done previously, loads of little notes, queries to myself, should look at this sometime, plus stuff other people have written. But then from then on, it was pretty much, nose to the grindstone and trying to hammer out as best I could what I wanted to say about the things I did write about. So, yeah.
The German Tolkien Society and representatives Tobias and Annika ask, are there plans for a German translation?
There are indeed, yes. I forget the publisher, but it's signed, it's being translated at the moment. Yeah.
Do we have a date in mind for that, or is it too early to tell at this point?
I can't say off the top of my head. I know that all the translations currently in preparation are this year or next year. So it's pretty soon.
Okay, those usually take a little while, I guess, to get all of the translation done.
Yeah, but one point is that all the translations will be somehow accommodated into the same page design.
Oh, wonderful! Because
Right.
it's such a beautiful volume.
Apparently, this is the standard way, and of course, that's reassuring for me because it means that all the work that went into this will be available to readers from other countries. I don't know how on earth they will manage to express everything I say in German, which seems to take, the words are probably too long for the columns. By the way, I recognise names of almost everyone. I think everyone, in fact, that you've asked questions for. So hello, everyone. That's
wonderful. Your own fan club here today for you. George Nadarf asks, are you familiar with Seamus Hamel Kay's, I'm not sure if I said the name right, paper on Tolkien and Buckland about Tolkien in Wales and Brecon Beacons? There are amazing parallels to the geography and history of Buckland in the Shire. Oh, he's got a page reference for us.
So there's a little panel about that, right? I think that Seamus's argument is very interesting, and he's done a great deal of very careful research. I still personally find that the threads haven't quite tied up, so I'm not entirely persuaded. But it may be that he's onto something, and that the smoking gun, the final bit of proof, will be found that ties it all together, and that will be fascinating. But I have my own theories. It's partly about the name Buckland. It hinges on the fact that there's an estate called Buckland Hall in this area of Wales. I elsewhere in the book give my own case for why Tolkien chose the name Buckland. It's not at all related to that. But again, one of my impressions from writing this book is that it's quite feasible that in any given case, Tolkien had more than one influence, potentially contradictory influences, potentially things that he changed his mind about, fluctuated between. I think he was a great synthesist who could take disparate materials and forge them into something that seems unified.
And he didn't always remember where he was getting these influences.
And of course, there's that too, yes. C.S. Lewis has this great passage in one of his essays where he says, never trust what a writer says about the process of writing, because to be frank, writers can't remember. While they're writing, they're creatively focused on what's emerging from them, not what's behind them.
Yeah. We have a thank you next. Marko Vasic from Serbia. Thank you for all the details that you enclosed in Tolkien and the Great War regarding the Book of Lost Tales and the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion's importance in Tolkien's literary work is often overlooked.
Thank you. I agree, of course.
And I just want to share one little anecdote before we close off today. I had a lady visit the Wade Center who told me about a local legend and I won't even tell you what it was, but it was something in England that she said influenced Tolkien, and it was this local legend that everybody knew about. And I had just happened to email John that same day, and I said, by the way, I just heard about, this one legend from this area from a lady today who visited the Wade Center from England, and John knew about it and had already planned on putting it in his book. So an amazing job on this book. Thank you so much to John for joining us in this inaugural virtual event for the Wade Center. And thank you all to our participants who have joined us today A reminder that you can get a discount from Princeton University Press for ordering this book. Tolkien20 is the discount code for 20% off and free shipping. And this event is being recorded, so you can find it on YouTube in the near future on the Wade Center's YouTube channel. So John, any closing thoughts?
Well, just thank you very much for having me. It's been marvelous. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.